this is a special EWTN on-location bookmark from Franciscan University in Steubenville. I'm Doug Keck here with the author, Stephen M. Krason. The book is Child Abuse, Family Rights, and the Child Protective System, a critical analysis from law, ethics, and Catholic social teaching. Welcome, Stephen, to EWTN's Bookmark. I should be welcoming myself to your location since we're here at Steubenville. This is your home, where you've been teaching for quite a few years, right?
I'm in my 28th year here, that's right.
And what do you teach?
Political science and legal studies. I'm a professor in both of those areas.
Now, here's an interesting book. You know, we usually don't do books dealing with child abuse and family rights and the child protective system. What is the connection to the Catholic social teaching, and why is this a book or a topic that Catholics in the pew out there should be concerned about?
Well, number one, it's because, of course, the Church has stressed the centrality of the family. It's the basic cell of society, of course. And you've had some various principles of Catholic social teaching that come into play here. One is the principle of subsidiarity and things that should be handled at the lowest level if they can be. And so you saw this reinforced quite a bit in some of John Paul II's social encyclicals, for example, and a restoration of the family, of its functions that have been taken over by other entities and so forth. And of course, as part of its stress upon the family, the Church has stressed the rights of parents. One mentioned the book is of Pope Leo XIII, way back in Rerum Novarum. And yes, the state, in certain circumstances, will have to intrude in the family when he says there's a mutual violation of mutual rights and so on. But he says those intrusions should be only as much as is necessary, and there can't be any kind of intrusion of the family and an attitude of doing it at the drop of a pin or something like that. There's an integrity to the family and so forth.
Is more of that happening today in your mind?
Well, I think the book makes very clear that the situation that we've had in this one area, at least now for 40 years or so, and that's involving the child protective system. In the name, supposedly, of addressing child abuse and neglect, the CPS, the Child Protective System, has engaged in a regimen of being able to intrude in the family pretty much at the drop of a pin. Anonymous complaints made about a family with, pursuant to laws which are unspecified, very vague. People just out there have ideas about what is the wrong way for a child to be treating a child and so forth. And a lot of times what you have is the CPS isn't really being concerned much about child abuse and neglect. They wind up being kind of regimenters of how parents raise their children and so forth. And you have a massive number of cases. This isn't a singular thing or an isolated thing. A massive number of cases of innocent families being accused. Sometimes it doesn't go beyond, very often it doesn't go beyond an initial kind of contact, an initial investigation. Sometimes it does go beyond that and become very prominent public cases.
Do you see this as, in a sense, an overreaction maybe to the situation, or at least a perception for people at one point in time that these things weren't being addressed, that there were problems going on and they were being kind of papered over, and now we have to make sure we're looking for it all the time? Well,
in part. I mean, I think there was the perception that some of the movers and shakers, the opinion makers in this particular area of child welfare had back in the 1960s and so forth, and they thought there was an increasingly massive problem of child abuse and neglect. When you look back historically, even though we heard quite a bit, for example, in the 70s and 80s about the epidemic of child abuse, it doesn't appear that there was evidence to back that up. And in fact, even the government's telling us now there's less than there was before, you know, but that's after 40 years of left and right intervention and so forth. But the evidence seems to be that there never was this epidemic of child abuse. Now, I will say one thing, though. There probably is, in an era of increasing moral relativism, the decay of the family itself, the decline of sound morality, there probably is more child abuse.
Right, and you talk about even the fact that when you're dealing with these broken up families, with step families in situations where you're not having biological situations in families, and then you've got pornography and things like that thrown into the mix, you could see where this kind of abuse can occur. Yeah,
even though the CPS seems to work from a set of principles, one of which is, you know, any parent's a potential abuser, abuser's just around the corner. The reality is, as one of the essays in the book illustrates, the reality is that the safest place for a child, the place where there is by far much less abuse than any other context, is in the intact biological family. Or an adopted family where parents are really, you know, are taking care of the child well and so forth. An intact family is the safest place for a child.
And you also have even the whole foster care situation and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's been called by some to be something of a scandal. Now, there are good foster parents out there, but there are some who are not good. And the amount of abuse in foster care situations is much higher than, of course, in the intact family. It's higher than the rates in the general population.
Right. And again, with all of these statements, No one's making a broad claim that this affects everybody. Obviously, there's been abuse. Obviously, there's wonderful families and couples out there who are as foster parents who are doing wonderful work, but there's also issues as well.
Yeah, I guess some people get into becoming foster parents not for the best motives, for financial reasons and so on, because the state gives them certain money for doing that. And you know, again, I don't know if the state holds people to the kind of standards we might think would be necessary to be a foster parent. You know, in terms of moral background and so forth. So at least completely, now certainly not in terms of religious background. You know, so you have those kinds of questions that certainly arise. It's foster care can be a dangerous situation for children. Again, there's some good foster parents, but there's some who are not good.
Now, right in the beginning, it talks about Catholic social thought. Now, there's a Society of Catholic Social Scientists. How does this book relate to that organization?
Well, this book came out of a special conference that the Society of Catholic Social Scientists had in the spring of 2012. We had it down at Catholic University. Our co-sponsor was the Catholic Social Workers National Association, which is an organization that developed to be faithful to the Church's teachings, but of Catholic social workers and so forth. And so we joined together on this, and I had done quite a bit of writing about this for, well, a quarter century now, and I knew different people, and the people we brought together to give the major talks are not all members of the society. In fact, they weren't all Catholic, actually. We had a Jewish scholar, we had an evangelical scholar, for example, and so we brought different people together who had written and worked in this area. And so it grew. The paper was, the book rather was the papers, the main papers from that conference, and I asked the people to work on certain topics, and this is the culmination of it.
And you edited this?
I edited the book. The Society of Catholic Social Scientists has a book series, Catholic Social Thought book series, through Rowman and Littlefield, and we've had the series now for about 4 years, and this was one of the books in that series.
Okay, now the foreword's by Ron Rishlak. Some of our audience at EWTN would know from his work at EWTN, some books having to do with Pius XII, etc. And he kind of gives a breakdown of the book, and at the end he says here, at the end of the day, one is left with concern for children who encounter actual abuse, but also with a new concern for adults who are falsely accused and for families that are torn apart by a system that encourages false accusations. How does the system encourage false accusations in your mind? Well,
one reason is by the fact that we have anonymous reporting is readily accepted by the system. We have these readily available hotlines in many cases. The numbers show up on TV, between TV programs, segments of TV programs, and so forth. I think there's been a drumbeat out there that there's child abuse all over the place, and people are encouraged to go and report it. And of course, as I said, it's exactly what abuse and neglect are. It's not defined clearly by any of the laws. The laws are very broad, and so you can almost drive a truck through those laws, frankly. So people are, in a very untutored fashion, encouraged to report people for things. And you add to that even the situation in recent years, our kind of homeland security mentality in a way, where people are increasingly encouraged to report suspicious activity. But the suspicious activity may not be any kind of serious activity, maybe nothing at all, really, but people are encouraged to do this. So you put this in the context, and that adds to it. But this was what apparently the architects of the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, the Mondale Act of 1974,
okay, which you talk about in the book,
that shaped our current system.
And that was, is that Walter Mondale?
Walter Mondale was the main sponsor of it in the Senate, and you know, people kind of went along. I guess they bought this argument that without much research, apparently. Don't always expect members of Congress to do a lot of serious research, by the way, about things. If there's a drumbeat that's particularly pushed by interest groups, that's right. Okay. Yeah. If there's a drumbeat particularly pushed by different interest groups, and here there were these academics, there were people in the child welfare community that were pushing this. They had this idea of unspecific laws. They saw the whole thing as a therapeutic kind of thing. They weren't too concerned about legal restraints upon what they would do, because their attitude was, as is pointed out in my article in the book, their attitude was, well, we're involved in trying to protect children, you know, we're involved in a therapeutic activity. We shouldn't be hamstrung with these kind of laws that would impede our activity and so forth. And the result, as I pointed out here, and some of the other authors point out, was that parents are given very few rights in their dealings with the Child Protective System.
Well, it's kind of almost like the healthcare law, where it was written so broadly that it really gets reinterpreted on a regular basis as to what it means or doesn't mean.
That's right, you know, and it's a very serious problem when you're talking about a political order like ours, which was supposed to be built on the rule of law, one of our basic founding principles, actually, and you create laws which are unspecific, which are very broad, which are overbroad and vague. The effect is to undercut the rule of law very seriously. And you were interesting that by raising the health care law, you know, it's become a real problem of our elected officials, our elected legislators. Number one, that they pass massive kinds of bills very often. 2,700 pages was the health care law. And you had at that time, the Speaker of the House who was asked what's in the bill. Well, we'll know about it when later on when people look at it, she apparently hadn't read it. Don't think most of those,
we'll find out what's in it.
Don't think most of those members of Congress are reading all these bills. They're not, and I think that's frankly a very scandalous thing in our time. Speaking as a political science professor.
Right, and this is, as one commentator put it, and this is in the preface you wrote, elected officials do not want to put clamps on the CPS because they fear being seen as coddling child abusers.
Yeah, that's right. The way our politics tends to be is it's a soundbite era in politics, and people seem to be concerned about too often about their own political advantage. So, they'll oppose maybe reauthorization of the Mondale Act or something, and then what will happen will be in the next election, an opponent will come forth and say, well, you're supporting the child abusers, when in reality, of course, if you look at the thing with any limited degree of care, you'll see the realities about the child protective system. In fact, I'm not sure the child protective system does a whole lot successfully to deal with child abuse. In fact, it's so concerned about petty things, it's so concerned about effectively monitoring families, child upbringing, and so forth in a very vague sense, that a lot of the real serious cases, as different authors have said, slip through the cracks because they're chasing a lot of minutiae.
You say the evidence has never shown that child abuse and neglect are truly a crisis in America, much less something that could be just around the corner in every American family. You say that, as this book shows, the evidence is overwhelming that most of what CPS does is not address true child abuse and neglect, but rather chase after false reports. Their apologists, leaders, and operatives are driven by often fallacious notions about the family, such as that spanking is a form of brutality. All parents are potential abusers. And you think about it in terms of the way I was raised or whatever, and I think with some of the things that goes on today, I could see where somebody would think, you get spanked or something, that you're being abused. Even the case not too long ago where a girl is suing her family because they're not paying for her college, because that's abusive treatment.
I should point out that the CPS seemed to be, as I understand it, reading the report, seemed to be sympathetic, open to her claims and so forth. That's the obvious culmination of a situation like this, an obvious expression of it, where you have laws which are vague, they can be easily manipulated. I've heard of other cases you'll hear about where you get kids who are high school age and so forth want to break away from their parents' constraints, so they'll sometimes make false reports about them and so forth. Yeah, this is all a result of the CPS mentality, of this kind of flawed notion about child protection, which doesn't, in the end, really protect the children who need to be protected a whole lot. I do make the point in the book that if we had simply law enforcement dealing with the real genuine cases of child abuse and a very carefully drafted criminal neglect statute, this would be adequate. What's happening now is that children are not getting protection, and a whole boatload of innocent parents are being falsely accused. That disrupts family life. That causes problems within the family. It hurts children. It hurts them psychologically. When they're taken away from the family, of course, they're hurt very much more, and oftentimes they're taken away on very slim, if non-existent pretenses. And foster care, we talked about the problems of foster care and the dangers that poses very often.
Well, there's an article here, it talks about shows conclusively something that I introduced in my article, that is, in broken, blended, and untraditional families and situations of cohabitation, single parentage, and the like, which our society seems to like very much, that child abuse and neglect are far more prevalent.
That's right. That was the article by Patrick Fagan down at the Family Research Council and his associates. He's one of the number crunchers in social sciences. He's in our Society of Catholic Social Scientists, and he's known for looking at that number crunching research, pulling it all together, and this is what they do in that article. And that seems to me to be the upshot of it. It's almost intuitive. He proves it with social science data that the true cases of serious abuse, genuine abuse, tend to occur much more frequently in the situation of so-called untraditional families. And it's very interesting that the people who are manning the CPS, so many of them, and certainly the ones who are the real movers and shakers, they don't seem to be concerned very often about those kinds of moral problems, those kind of families that grow out of that kind of moral outlook. I remember back about 20 years ago, I had the noted scholar of the family, American family, Alan Carlson, speak here. And Alan Carlson mentioned going to a kind of a program I think the CPS had at one point, a lecture program, and he said it seemed to me that the only kind of problem they could see in terms of moral outrage would be something something involving things that they called child abuse and neglect, but they didn't seem to be ready to point the finger at any kind of these other wrongs at all. Sexual wrongs, other kinds of family situations,
because that would be judgmental.
Something like that, yeah. I think that permeates the system, except when it comes to this. There's a lot of judgment made about families, and in fact, the CPS mentality grew out of, I think, the whole scholarly kind of background of those scholars who were increasingly rejecting the traditional family in the whole post-war period, particularly the 1960s.
Right. And also, I mean, we get a sense as well, we hear voices out there that really talk about how, parents, you don't own your children, in a sense, and ultimately their rights. And all of those things are true to a certain degree, but in many ways, it's kind of the idea of where the state wants to have its relationship directly with the child and push the parent out of the equation.
That seems to be happening in a whole range of things. In the Affordable Care Act, the Obamacare law, I mean, there's a provision in there which is the president is now seeking funding for. I think he's seeking $15 billion, this provision, which will assign basically different professionals to sort of monitor children from birth. They're into the birth to 5-year-old monitoring that group. They want to have universal preschool and this kind of thing, but this is another thing that was put in there. It's somewhat similar. I have to look at all the dimensions of it, but it has some ring of what's been approved by the legislature in Scotland, where they're going to assign every child from birth a social worker, and the state knows much better. This is utterly a collectivist mentality. The CPS, as I point out, and that kind of mentality generally, which permeates the Western world, this has very evident totalitarian implications. We're seeing many dimensions of this emerging on particularly the social issues in the Western world now. We're seeing it with the homosexualist movement, for example, and some of these cases that you're seeing in this country. And that's all part of this mentality, I think, of the state knows better. Even though those people who man the levers of power in the state like that, I guess they're a kind of very much an untutored elite themselves. They're not well philosophically formed. They operate by, I mentioned some of the kind of principles, the doctrines that shape the CPS.
Right.
They're very shallow kind of based kind of positions. They're not really deeply educated, and they're trained almost functionally in some respects.
Right, and if you talk about this thing called the Immaculate Confession Doctrine, and the idea that in some ways that they can overcome all the things that common sense would say, this is probably not true. They invert them to say, well, they don't want to own up to it. They don't want to. So ultimately, you can end up in a situation where you can justify virtually anything.
Yeah, and this Immaculate Conception, the Immaculate Confession Doctrine, rather, applies to, when children are supposedly being interviewed by CPS officials, and if they say there was abuse, we take it as a given. If they recant, we can't accept the recanting, however. Now, what's happened in these kind of cases, one of the most, I think, insidious things that happens with a CPS, one of the ways children are harmed, is that the kind of interrogations that go on. I filed a brief on behalf of the Society of Catholic Social Scientists in a case that involved the CPS before the Supreme Court a few years ago. And one of the things I pointed out was there was a situation of a very intense kind of interrogation. The idea is it's so much of a pressure situation, they try to get the child to ultimately say that there was some abuse, even if there wasn't, okay, because they want to get out of the situation. It's a pressured situation. Right. And I made the point in the brief that if you look at this kind of a situation, it seems to violate international human rights norms, involving interrogations. It's something of a form of psychological torture under international human
Wouldn't
rights
they be upset about that if they found out that was being done to some person who was being considered a criminal and being treated that way? They think this is highly upsetting. Now, you mentioned Rerum Novarum taught that the family was, quote unquote, the society of the household, which existed prior to the state. Consequently, the state was obliged to respect the inherent rights and integrity of the family, and go on to say parental authority is such that it cannot be abolished nor absorbed by the state. But that's in many cases what we see happening.
I think so with this collectivist mentality. The state claims a prior, kind of a prior control in a sense, kind of a prior authority and so forth. It doesn't get this from natural law. These are ideas that have grown up in a very secular kind of ideological context, probably going back to Marxism in the 19th century and the kind of vulgarized impact of Marxism on Western cultures. I mean, it took hold in a big way in the old Soviet bloc and so forth, and in China, Southeast Asia and so forth, but in a vulgarized way it had its influence in the West. And I think that's somewhat what you're seeing here, and some other streams of thought that come forth into this as well, very much from this kind of secular, philosophical, and ideological angle.
Which runs counter to the Church's teaching. In the Declaration on Christian Education, the Church asserted that A, parents are the primary educators of their children, B, that such education prepares children to take their place in society and in the Church, and C, that the role of the state is to assist, not to substitute for parents in this task.
That's right, and John Paul II re-emphasized that, in his encyclicals. The state is supposed to provide assistance and help families if there's a need and so forth. The social teaching of the Church stresses this kind of a thing, and so on. The state's role is to complement and to assist, not to take control of. One of the things we have to be so wary about in our day, however, you see it in many different situations, is that when the government kind of shows up, even they say when they want to assist you, there's always the not so there's the sort of rusty line. You hear about the silver line. There's the rusty lining, if you will, where they want to impose conditions. I mean, you see this when the federal government gives money to the states for a whole range of things, but you see it when there are other kind of grant programs when the federal government comes along supposedly to help people. I remember the comment that President Ronald Reagan made. We often quote, the most dangerous words, "I'm from the state and I'm here to help you."
Right, exactly. Now, in the chapter we were talking about, Patrick Fagan was involved with incidents of spousal and intimate partner violence. Marriage is protective against both physical and emotional abuse for men and women as these older age. Analysis of the Fragile Families and Child Well-Being Study found that married mothers are less likely to be abused by their children's father than are cohabitating mothers, dating mothers, or mothers who are not in any sort of a relationship with their child's father. Their relationships with the fathers of their children are also marked by the lowest level of relational conflict. Mm-hmm. So what does it tell us? It tells us that God's plan is the right plan, right?
Right, well, the plan from nature. I mean, the great pagan philosophers like Aristotle saw the same thing, and it's very interesting that when you read that and you read Pat Fagan's chapter there, supposedly all this new attitude about sexual morality coming forth, especially from the 1960s, this was going to be liberating. It actually has opened the door to greater exploitation. Of the woman and certainly of the child,
Well, we certainly see that. I mean, Paul VI said it in Humanae Vitae of what was going to happen, and really the objectification of women, certainly, and now we see with the homosexual situation, and then we're starting to see this child situation where all of a sudden, how children can act on their own, etc.
I mean, I think this whole idea is going in one certain direction here, and a false notion of freedom, a false notion of liberation, which leads to, of course, a whole range, and it's almost intuitive that it would happen, a whole range of new exploitation. And the state comes in after it's given this freedom and promoted these ideas, they come in saying, we're the rescuer, What they wind up being is kind of a new oppressor.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you ask people and they see this today, is it too late? Is the wave so great that this is just the way it's going to be?
Well, one of the thinkers that I thought a great deal of was Russell Kirk, and if you go up to Mecosta, Michigan, where his home was, after his death, they set up the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal. He was very upbeat about the possibilities of renewal, And I think that has to work on different levels. In another book I came out with a couple years ago, I talked about how the American political order has been transformed over its history in a negative direction. And I talked about ways that could be addressed. I thought at a very basic individual and family level, we have to build things up. For people to be serious about their marriage vows again, for people to be serious about their role as parents, for people to learn about the Constitution, for professors in secular universities where they can't maybe teach what they the truth about these things, have little informal groups and so on, all things on that kind of level. But you can go up to another level too, I'm going to say this very quickly here, a few different levels here, On the other hand, I think, I thought that some of the developments, the early developments of the Tea Party movement were encouraging. Now, they went in a certain direction, though, focusing on politics a lot. But if you remember some of the earlier things, they would have these rallies and things in Washington. I think that would be be a good direction to go to. I'd like to see rallies in state capitals, you know, in opposition to the CPS when the bills come up and so forth that might reauthorize or expand their role and so forth. I think we should see more of that kind of very, actually completely legal sort of public mass activity. And I think we have to be very careful as citizens to pin down our officials about this and so forth. And I've also talked about something recently that some people get a little nervous about, but I think we have to think about it increasingly seriously on a whole range of things, you know. We're going to be facing a presidential election in 2 years, you know, and I don't know if there's anybody out there like this now, but I think we have to think about the proper use of executive power to negate a lot of these dangerous things, you know. Well, the Justina Pelletier case going on in Massachusetts now, frankly, you know, I would argue that the president has perhaps an inherent power to intervene in a case like that, you know, to rescue her and so forth, you know. If you take in another area, the life issues area, you know, we had the Terry Schiavo case some years ago, you know. I would argue the president has inherent power to rescue a person like that. So I think we need to look to the truly virtuous man, capable man and so forth, and a very prudent man. We have to look for the new American Cincinnatus in some respects, you know, when we choose these political leaders. And, you know, George Washington was our first Cincinnatus, you know, and one who would use executive power in a very sweeping way, but a restrained way, you know, a kind of a new Lincoln in a certain sense.
Well, I would think that a university located in Ohio would come up with him as the name. Thank you so much, Stephen. Good to talk with Stephen M. Krason. A very interesting, thought-provoking book, Child Abuse, Family Rights, and the Child Protective System, a critical analysis from law, ethics, and Catholic social teaching. Join us next time on EWTN's Bookmark.